The first modern Olympic marathon ended here, in Athens' Panathenaic Stadium, an architectural wonder built entirely of marble nearly 2,000 years ago. The second Olympic marathon began in the Bois de Boulogne and wound through the streets of Paris, the City of Light. And the third Olympic marathon happened here, right outside this cheesecake factory. A Dillard's, a Five Guys, and a Nordstrom hold watch over this marathon's path. Its route is drenched in the shadow of a crate and barrel. The 1904 St. Louis Olympic Marathon was a disaster. It was a story of fraud, thievery, raw eggs, rat poison, food poisoning, liquor, feral dogs, and at least 3 separate incidents of near death. It was the stupidest sporting event of all time. Hello. I bought you a present. Go on, open it. Why won't you open it? Oh, right, here. I'm so sorry. I'll do it. Look, it's a board game. The 1904 St. Louis Marathon. It was very expensive. I bought it at this store. Oh, goodness, that's rude of me. I'm sorry. Would you like to play? Yeah, let's play. I guess that's the board. Some eggs, a couple of apples, a couple of bottles of brandy. Oh, here's the rule book. How to play. Yeah, what are the rules for marathons anyway? Oh, okay, you know what? Oh, hey, looks like they threw in a couple expansion decks. Lucky us. Good ideas expansion deck. Let's see. Safety, sportsmanship, proper hydration, sobriety. We're not going to need any of these. 1904 Olympics. Oh, well, yeah, let's see what these Olympics were all about. 4 months long? What? Oh my god. You know what? Let's not use those. If you want to read more about that, I'll send you some links when we're done. Cool? Alright, cool. Alright, let's bust out this board. This was the route of the 1904 Olympic Marathon. These streets still exist in suburban St. Louis today, most of them with the same names. The runners ran a few laps around the track at Francis Field, then out onto Forsyth, south on Merrimack and Brentwood, west on Manchester, north on Ballas Road, east on Clayton, north on what is now Lindbergh Boulevard, east on Olive, south on North and South, and then back on Forsyth to cross the finish line back at Francis Field. Or at least, that was the plan. Across the entire history of the men's Olympic marathon, 1,421 runners have finished with a time they bothered to record. They're represented on this bar, ranked from best time to worst time. The champion of this 1904 marathon ranks here. Just consider how absurd that is. The guy who won this marathon was slower than 98% of the finishers of every other marathon. In fact, he was really slow. These are the finish times of every Olympic marathon champion. These days, they usually take somewhere between 2 hours, 15 minutes. Older marathons took longer, but none took nearly as long to decide as the 1904 marathon, which was nearly a half hour longer than every other marathon on record. Now, every marathon has its share of dropouts. Usually about 75 to 80% of runners slated for a marathon actually finish it. In 1904, 41 runners were entered into the marathon. 9 didn't show up. Only 14 actually finished. That's a finish rate of just 34%. From the outset, John Lorden seemed like a favorite. He won the Boston Marathon a year prior and was considered one of the best distance runners in the world. Well, he made it about here, and then he started vomiting profusely, and then he quit. 2 blocks. He made it 2 blocks. How is that possible? How did a Boston Marathon champion bite it after 4 laps around a track and 2 blocks of jogging? What made this race so awful? The answer was a seemingly endless number of things, but I'll stop at 5. First off, it was really hot. I'm taking this from a paper published by Dr. Bill Roberts. He's a marathon director, and he contends that the ideal marathon temperature is 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit at the start of the race. Above that, dropouts and health issues increase. Dr. Roberts recommends that if the apparent temperature is 70 or warmer at the start of a marathon, you should maybe think about postponing that marathon. The temperature in St. Louis that day was recorded at 90 degrees in the shade. But along that route, there was almost no shade. In the sunlight, the temperature was probably closer to 100 or 105 degrees. That's not even taking the humidity into account, and as any Missourian will tell you, it can get humid as all hell. So clearly, they had to keep the runners hydrated. They didn't. According to most sources I'm relying on, there was only one water source, a well about 12 miles in. As for that well, it was a well. From the account of Charles J.P. Lucas, remember that name by the way, the visiting athletes were not accustomed to the water, and as a consequence, many suffered from intestinal disorders. So there's one water source, and it gives you butt problems. And that's it. For the last 13 miles, you're on your own. About 19 miles in, American runner William Garcia was found lying on the side of the road, coughing up blood. If a passing car hadn't found him, he probably would have died, but not because of dehydration, at least not directly. See, Garcia wasn't running on pavement. These were mostly dirt roads that were described in at least one account as inches deep in dust. They weren't really meant for cars, but cars were driving on them anyway. They were driven by the race officials and trainers, and they didn't give the runners a lot of space. Their tires would kick up these massive clouds of dust that blinded and choked the runners. Garcia had swallowed so much dust that it effectively sanded the membrane off the inside of his stomach and caused massive hemorrhaging. He almost bled to death. And when the route wasn't covered in dust, it was full of rocks. Some parts of the course were just covered in broken, jagged stones for runners to tiptoe through in basic turn-of-the-century footwear. If they even had footwear, which Len Tagnane and John Masciane didn't. These two were the first African competitors in any event in the history of the Olympic Games. They were veterans of the Second Boer War who were only in St. Louis in the first place as war reenactors. Alright, so let's back up just a little bit. The 1904 Olympics were originally awarded to Chicago. The St. Louis World's Fair was scheduled for 1903 to celebrate the 100-year anniversary of the Louisiana Purchase, but they couldn't get it together and they had to push it back to 1904. So that meant two international events in the same region at the same time. That competition for spectators was bad news for both events. After a lot of political wrangling, St. Louis effectively stole the Olympics from Chicago and reduced it to a sideshow of the World's Fair, which was itself essentially a giant celebration of imperialism and racism that is beyond the scope of this video. Among the events were reenactments of battles from the Second Boer War that were put on by 600 actual soldiers who actually fought on both sides of the actual Boer War, which seems kind of gross to me, but then again, so do most of the things I'm talking about here. Anyway, the St. Louis Olympics were stupid and the rest of the world didn't really care about them. The president of the Olympic Committee didn't even bother showing up. Only 14 countries sent any athletes to America. This marathon really needed participants, so Tagnane and Masciane signed up. They both finished. Tagnane was chased about a mile off course by a couple of wild dogs. He finished 9th. So, to recap, 100-degree heat, near complete lack of water, suffocating dust that almost killed a man, terrible terrain, and feral dogs. And let's add one more hazard for Felix Carvajal. He was wearing street clothes. Get ready to meet your new hero. Felix de la Caridad Carvajal y Soto was a mailman from Cuba. He had never run a marathon, he had never run competitively, the Cuban Olympic Committee did not invite him, and he didn't have enough money to get himself to the Olympics. That didn't stop Carvajal, who raised money by putting on running exhibitions, which I guess is just running for tips. According to one source, he actually ran the entire 700-mile length of Cuba. After a while, he raised the money he needed, and he took a boat to New Orleans, where he promptly lost all his money in a craps game. He was broke. St. Louis was another 700 miles away. Some of the way he hitchhiked or stowed away on a train car, some of the way he just ran. And when he finally showed up at Francis Field that day, he looked like... Well, look how everyone else is dressed. Sleeveless shirts, shorts without belts, athletic shoes, you know, the kind of stuff you'd wear if you were about to run a 100-degree marathon. Our friend Felix here is running this thing in a baggy long-sleeve shirt, street shoes, a belt, a beret, long johns, and heavy shorts. And even those weren't originally shorts. Carvajal actually wore long pants on top of his long johns to the race, but another runner saw him and said, "Hey, nope, you're not running in these." He got some scissors and cut him off at the knees. I think Carvajal wore this stuff because it was all he had. Okay, listen, I'm going to tell you this part of the story even though I don't think it's true, for two reasons. The first being that it's hilarious, and the second being that Smithsonian's website claims that it's true, so did Marathon and Beyond magazine, so did a couple other sources I read. It can't have happened. It's too stupid. The story goes that the peaches Mr. Carvajal stole weren't enough for him, and he was still hungry. At one point, he stumbled upon an apple orchard. He picked a couple apples, and he ate them. Turned out those apples were rotten. He got a stomachache, lied down, and took a nap. After a while, he got up, started running again, and finished in 4th place. To recap, a Boston Marathon champion quits this race after a few blocks. A mailman from Cuba in a beret and long johns who had never run a professional race and wasn't even invited and took a nap in the middle of the marathon finished 4th. So there you have it. That's the stupidest story of the 1904 St. Louis Olympic Marathon. I'm just kidding, it gets way stupider. Fred Lors was first off the starting line. He would later win the 1905 Boston Marathon, but this is the race he's remembered for. Without adequate water supply, lots of the runners are suffering from severe cramps, and Lors is one of them. 9 miles in, he throws in the towel, and one of the cars gives him a ride. Meanwhile, at the 16-mile mark, Thomas Hicks has built a considerable lead over the rest of the pack, but he's beginning to fall apart. He's completely dehydrated. Just behind him, his trainers are trailing him in an automobile. This is Charles J.P. Lucas, one of the trainers in the car. He wrote a book about the race that has proven to be a very valuable account. He was also a giant idiot. A little over halfway through the course, Hicks is begging Lucas for a drink of water. Lucas won't let him drink any, but he does offer to sponge out his mouth with water for some reason, and he also pours some water over him. And then he feeds him some egg white. And then he feeds him rat poison. Again from his book, and then the author was forced to administer 1/60th grain of sulfate of strychnine. Okay, everyone, I think we probably better get a smart person on the phone. Dr. Sidney McElroy is the co-host of Sawbones, a podcast about the horrors of old-timey medicine. So if there's anyone to ask about strychnine, it's probably her. Strychnine is bad, right?
Generally speaking, yes. I certainly would not prescribe strychnine to somebody. If you take too much, it'll kill you. That's the bad thing about strychnine. It's like a really super-powered bad caffeine.
What does it do if you take too much?
So it blocks glycine receptors, and glycine is kind of what stops things. So once a nerve starts firing for us to move or do something, glycine stops that action. So if you block glycine, you're kind of turning off the off switch, so to speak. So you can't turn off. A little bit of that might make you better at running, say, a marathon. A lot of that would cause very violent, nonstop muscle contractions all over your body. If you've ever seen classic paintings of people with tetanus in that arched position, it's the same kind of thing, like this awful arched position of your back that you would get stuck in, and then eventually you would stop breathing and die. It would be a horrible way to go.
Given everything you said, I was going to take 10 pounds of strychnine, and after talking to you, I actually don't even think I'm going to take any strychnine.
I think that's the better plan.
Meanwhile, Fred Lors, who quit the race due to dehydration, is about 10 miles into his car ride home when the car breaks down. It's hot, and the sun is beating down, and Lors sees no point in just standing around for hours waiting for help. Plus, he's starting to feel better, so he decides to get on his feet and start running again. At the 20-mile mark, Hicks is falling apart. His skin is described as ashen pale. He's given more strychnine, and a couple more eggs. And now Lucas decides to give him Brandy, too. In his book, Lucas calls Brandy a stimulant, which it is definitely not. He's giving his runner rat poison and brandy and raw eggs and sponging his mouth out with water and dumping water on his head, but he won't actually let his marathon runner drink water. Charles J.P. Lucas is the worst coach in the history of the world. At this point, Hicks is begging Lucas to let him lie down, and Lucas is like, nope, keep going. And then Fred Lors gallops past him, looking almost impossibly good for someone 20 miles into a marathon. Hicks sees him, and his morale is destroyed. It looks like he might quit at any second. Thankfully, they learn that Lors is actually out of the race, so Hicks puts his chin back up and he starts to jog again. Hicks is still in the lead with 1 mile to go, again from Lucas. His eyes were dull, lusterless, the ashen color of his face and skin had deepened. His arms appeared as weights well tied down. He could scarcely lift his legs, while his knees were almost stiff. In addition to 2 doses of strychnine, Hicks has now finished his entire canteen of brandy, so a friendly bystander gives him more brandy. He's losing it, even though he's only 1 mile from the finish line. Hicks keeps hallucinating that he's still 20 miles out. He won't stop asking for food, and he's still begging for water. The answer from his trainers is still no. It's a miracle he's even standing. At this point, Lucas and another caretaker, H.C. McGrath, are helping him around, half-carrying him. Hicks finally staggers down the last hill and into the stadium, just in time to see the officials prepare to present the trophy to Fred Lors. See, a marathon is a particularly weird thing to officiate and spectate prior to the advent of radio or TV or reliable cars. I mean, these people in the stadium saw a bunch of dudes run away, and then they sat around for 3.5 hours, and then they saw one of the dudes run back in. That dude was Fred Lors, and the crowd went nuts for him. He could have mentioned to somebody that he actually quit the race and rode half the course in a car, but he didn't. He just kind of let everyone think he won. When Hicks' team pitched a fit, Lors readily admitted, "No, yeah, I cheated. I was just messing with everybody." He just thought the whole thing was funny. Lors accepted his disqualification and a lifetime ban that was rescinded a few months later. And that enabled Olympic officials to rightly present the winner's trophy to an almost dead, drunk, rat-poisoned man who probably had no idea what was going on. The second Hicks crossed the finish line, he literally fell into the arms of his manager. He was too weak to accept the trophy. They loaded him into a car and took him straight to the hospital. Over the course of a 3-hour, 28-minute, 53-second marathon run, Thomas Hicks had lost 8 pounds. So, you know how there was only one source of water? Do you want to know why there was only one source of water? Okay, I'm going to read this off the screen. I want to make sure I get it exactly right. James Edward Sullivan was an Olympic official. He was later named the Secretary of the U.S. Olympic Committee, and today he's in the National Track and Field Hall of Fame. That's James Sullivan. I'm going to read you a slight paraphrase from a book titled The 1904 Anthropology Days and Olympic Games. To test his more radical ideas, Sullivan and several personal trainers chose the marathon. The marathon thus serves as an excellent and infamous example of Sullivan's combination of flawed science and dubious comparisons. Sullivan provided only one official water stop to minimize fluid intake, to test how far purposeful dehydration could be taken. He used the Olympic marathon as an experiment. He denied marathon runners water and subjected them to life-threatening conditions because he wanted to see what would happen. I'm so fucking pissed off. They were lab rats in his big, cruel experiment. They didn't even know it. What an asshole. What a stupid asshole. Thomas Hicks gave every scrap of effort his body could muster in the service of the world's stupidest sporting event. It didn't deserve his sacrifice, or Carvajal's, or Garcia's, or anyone else's. This was only the third modern Olympics, long before the Olympiad became the behemoth it is today. The prize they gave everything for was to have your name printed in small type in a table on a page of a dusty old book that sits closed in the dark and perhaps opened out of curiosity long after you're gone. All these people are gone. Everyone who saw them is gone. The wretched earth they ran on is gone. It's all asphalt. I grew up in suburbs like this one, in Kansas, Georgia, Kentucky, places so ordinary that ghosts don't even live there. Streets so normal, so full of TJ Maxx's and Starbucks that they play this trick on you, like nothing of any real importance could ever have happened there. That's a running shoe store. Missouri Running Company, Google tells me. You can't make that up. Right there on the marathon route. Lynn Tagnane and John Masciani and Felix Carvajal really could have used this back then. I wonder if these people have any idea.